The transport ship landed on the ice with a heavy thud that shook Jake Martinez from his seat. Through the small window, he could see nothing but white snow stretching to the horizon under a gray sky. The wind howled outside like a beast trying to get in. Jake pulled his jacket tighter and checked his gear one more time. The door opened with a hiss and cold air rushed in like a slap to the face. Jake stepped out onto the frozen ground of Kepler 442c, and his breath came out in white clouds. The temperature display on his wrist showed minus 58 degrees. He had worked in cold places before, but nothing like this. 47 beings stood in a rough circle on the ice. Jake looked around at his fellow candidates and saw creatures he had only read about in books. There were tall reptile-like sectari with green scales already turning dark from the cold. Small insect creatures called krillex clicked their mandibles nervously. Plant-based Florians swayed in their thick thermal suits like trees in wind. Other species huddled together trying to stay warm. A crystal being floated above them. Its body was clear like ice, but it glowed with blue light from inside. This was a Vorthak, and it spoke without moving any mouth. Its voice came from everywhere at once like the wind itself was talking. "Welcome to the final test," the Vorthak said. "You have 7 days to survive on this world. The temperature will drop to minus 60 degrees at night. You each have basic supplies. Use them wisely. Those who cannot continue will be removed. Those who complete 7 days will join the Galactic Survival Academy." Jake looked at his supplies. 1 sleeping bag rated for minus 20 degrees. 3 days of food bars. A small heat source that would last 6 hours, some basic tools. A knife, emergency flares, water purification tablets. It was not much for 7 days in hell, the Vorthak continued talking. Your survival depends on your species' natural abilities. Some are strong, some are smart, some adapt quickly. The weak will be eliminated. This is the way of the galaxy. Jake frowned at those words. He had heard this kind of talk before. The galaxy was full of beings who thought they knew which species were strong and which were weak. They looked at humans and saw no fur for warmth, no thick skin, no natural weapons. They saw weakness. They were usually wrong. The crystal being floated away and left them alone on the ice. Immediately, the other candidates began to spread out looking for good places to set up camp. Jake watched them for a few minutes. The Sectari were already moving slowly. Cold blood meant they could not function well in cold temperatures. The krillex were trying to burrow into the ice, but their small bodies were losing heat fast. The Florians were shivering inside their suits. Jake picked up his pack and walked away from the group. He needed to find the right spot quickly. The sun was already low in the sky, and night would bring even colder temperatures. He walked for 10 minutes until he found what he was looking for. A small hill with rocks sticking out of the snow. Perfect. He began to dig. Not just a hole, but a proper snow cave. His hands were cold, but he kept working. He dug an entrance that sloped down, then up again. This would keep cold air from flowing into his shelter. Cold air was heavy and would stay in the lower entrance while warm air would rise to where he slept. As he dug, Jake thought about his training in Alaska. The instructors had taught him that snow was not just cold white stuff. It was an insulator. A good snow cave could be 30 degrees warmer inside than outside. The trick was building it right. He carved out a sleeping area higher than the entrance. He made the roof dome shape so melting snow would run down the walls instead of dripping on him. He smoothed the walls with his hands and packed them tight. Then he poked a small hole through the roof for airflow. Night came fast. Jake could hear the wind getting stronger outside. He set up his sleeping bag in the cave and ate 1 food bar. Then he lit his small heat source for 1 hour to warm up the space. The cave held the heat much better than he had hoped. Outside he could hear sounds of struggle. Someone was crying in a high-pitched voice. Another voice was calling for help. Jake looked out of his cave entrance and saw several heat sources burning bright in the distance. The other candidates were using their 6-hour heat sources all at once to fight the cold. Jake shook his head. They were making a mistake. 6 hours of heat on the first night meant no heat for the next 6 nights. Panic was making them waste their most important resource. Jake settled into his sleeping bag and felt proud of his cave. The temperature inside was much warmer than outside. He could hear more sounds of distress in the distance. The Krilleks were making chittering noises that sounded like pain. The Florians were making low moaning sounds. Even some of the species he thought would do better were struggling. Jake closed his eyes but did not sleep right away. He was planning. Tomorrow he would need to improve his shelter. He would need to find ways to make heat without using his emergency supplies. He would need to find water and maybe improve his food situation. Most importantly, he would need to prove that humans were not weak. The wind howled outside, but inside his snow cave Jake was warm enough to sleep. As he drifted off, he thought about the Vorthok's words about natural abilities. Maybe humans did not have thick fur or natural weapons, but they had something else. They had brains that could solve problems. They had hands that could build things. They had the ability to change their environment instead of just enduring it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Jake was ready. He had survived the first night while others were already in trouble. This was just the beginning. Jake woke up to the sound of a transport ship taking off in the distance. He crawled to his cave entrance and looked out to see the ship disappearing into the gray sky. Someone had not made it through the first night. Jake felt bad for whoever it was, but he also felt relieved. His snow cave had worked. The morning was still brutally cold, but Jake felt good. His sleeping bag was dry, and he had slept warm enough. He ate another food bar and drank some water from his bottle. The water was starting to freeze, so he kept the bottle inside his jacket close to his body. Jake crawled out of his cave and stood. Up in the morning light, he could see the camps of other candidates scattered across the ice. 3 spots that had heat sources burning the night before were now empty. The transport ship had taken away 3 candidates who could not handle the cold. He walked toward the nearest camp and found one of the plant creatures lying still in the snow. The Florian was still alive but barely moving. Its thermal suit was covered in frost and its leaves were turning black from cold damage. Jake wanted to help, but he knew the rules. This was a test, and helping others might get him eliminated too. Moving away from the dying Florian, Jake walked to higher ground to get a better look at the area. In the distance he could see a pile of metal debris. It looked like pieces from old ships or equipment that had crashed here long ago. This gave Jake an idea. He spent the morning walking to the debris field. The metal pieces were frozen solid and some were buried in snow, but there were useful things here. Sheets of metal, pipes, wire, and other materials that could be used to improve his shelter. Jake picked up what he could carry and headed back to his cave. On the way back he passed more camps. The Krilleks had managed to dig tunnels in the ice, but they were shivering badly. Their insect bodies were not made for this kind of cold. One group of them had huddled together in a ball trying to share body heat, but Jake could see they were failing. The Sectari were in even worse shape. 3 of the large reptile creatures were lying motionless in the snow. One was still moving, but very slowly. Cold-blooded animals could not function when their body temperature dropped. They were living proof that natural adaptation was not always enough. Jake got back to his cave and began working on improvements. He used the metal sheets to make a wind barrier around his entrance. This would block the cold wind and create a small area where he could work outside without losing too much body heat. Then he used pieces of wire to hang his wet clothes in a way that would let them dry without freezing solid. The most important improvement was a heat collector system. Jake took a large curved piece of metal and polished it with snow until it was shiny. He positioned this to reflect sunlight into his cave entrance during the day. It was not much heat, but every bit helped. He also used smaller pieces of metal as heat sinks. During the day when the sun was out, he would put these metal pieces in the sunlight. At night, he would bring them into his cave where they would slowly release their stored heat. While Jake worked on his shelter, he noticed another human candidate nearby. She was a woman with short brown hair who moved with military precision. Jake had seen her during the initial briefing but had not talked to her. She was building something different from his snow cave. The woman had created a fire pit using rocks and metal pieces. She was burning something that gave off steady heat and light. Jake walked over to introduce himself and see what she was doing. "I am Jake Martinez," he said when he got close enough to talk without shouting over the wind. "Lisa Park?" she replied without stopping her work. "Former military survival instructor. You built a good snow cave. I saw you working on it yesterday." Jake looked at her fire pit and saw she was not burning wood. There was no wood on this frozen world. Instead, she was burning pieces of emergency flares in a controlled way. The flares were designed to burn hot and bright for emergency signals, but Lisa had figured out how to make them burn slowly and steadily for heat. "Smart idea with the flares," Jake said. "How long will they last?" "Each flare can give me about 4 hours of heat if I control the burn rate," Lisa explained. "I have 6 flares, so that gives me 24 hours of heat total. I'm using 1 hour per night to keep from freezing." Jake nodded. It was a good plan, but it still had the same problem as everyone else. Limited fuel meant limited heat. After 6 nights, Lisa would have no more flares and would be in the same situation as the aliens who were already failing. "What happens after? You run out of flares?" Jake asked. Lisa smiled and pointed to a pile of stones near her fire. "I'm heating these rocks during my burn time. Hot rocks stay warm for hours after the fire goes out. I rotate them to keep my sleeping area warm all night. Plus, I'm looking for other things to burn." Jake was impressed. Lisa had found a different solution to the same problem he was solving. She was using technology and planning just like he was. It made him feel good to see another human thinking the same way. They talked for a while about their different approaches. Jake showed Lisa his heat collector system, and she showed him how to control the burn rate of emergency flares. They both agreed that the key was not just surviving, but finding ways to improve their situation. Every day, as the second day ended, Jake could see that more candidates were in trouble. The sounds of distress were getting louder and more frequent. Several more heat sources had burned out completely. The Vorthak probe ships were circling overhead like vultures, waiting for more candidates to give up. Jake settled into his improved cave for the second night. His metal heat sinks were working well, and his cave was noticeably warmer than the night before. Outside, the wind was howling even louder, but inside he was comfortable enough to think and plan. He thought about Lisa and her approach to the problem. 2 humans had found 2 different ways to beat the cold, while aliens with supposedly better natural adaptations were failing one by one. Jake was starting to understand something important. The test was not really about surviving the cold. It was about adapting and improving and finding solutions. It was about using intelligence instead of just enduring with natural abilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Jake was ready. He had survived 2 nights, and his situation was getting better instead of worse. The other candidates were getting weaker while he was getting stronger. This was exactly what humans did best. The third morning brought the sound of 2 transport ships instead of 1. Jake looked out from his cave entrance and counted the empty camps. 7 candidates had been taken away during the night. The alien species were dropping out fast while the cold claimed more victims. Jake felt stronger than he had since arriving on this frozen world. His improvements were working, and he had slept well. His snow cave was now a complex system with multiple chambers connected by tunnels. He had dug a cold trap entrance that kept the worst air out. A main living chamber where he could sit up and work on things. A sleeping chamber that stayed the warmest. Even a small storage area for his supplies and the metal pieces he had collected. After eating his morning food, Jake went outside to check on the other candidates. The scene was getting worse each day. Most of the Sekthari were completely motionless now. Their cold blood had made them too slow to function. The few that were still alive could barely move their heads to track him as he walked past. The Krilleks were still trying to help each other, but their chittering sounds were weak and desperate. Jake could see several of them had stopped moving. During the night, their small bodies just could not hold enough heat to survive. The few survivors were huddled in a tight ball, but even that was failing. The Florians were down to just 2 survivors, and both looked like they were dying. Their leaves were black with cold damage, and their thermal suits were covered in frost. One was making soft moaning sounds while the other had gone completely silent. Jake walked to the debris field again to look for more useful materials. Today, he found something very interesting. A large piece of curved metal that looked like it came from a ship's hull. It was big enough to use as a roof for an expanded shelter. He also found several pieces of pipe that could be used to move air or water. On his way back to Camp, Jake passed Lisa's fire pit. She was working on something new. She had built a stone circle around her fire and was placing hot rocks in a careful pattern. When she saw Jake approaching, she waved him over. "I figured out something important," Lisa said with excitement in her voice. "The rocks hold heat much longer if you heat them really hot instead of just warm. I'm cooking them in my fire for an hour, then using them as heat sources for the rest of the day." Jake looked at her setup and saw the intelligence behind it. Lisa had created a thermal battery system. She would use her limited fuel to create very hot rocks, then coast on that. Stored heat for many hours. It was brilliant engineering with primitive materials. "How long do the rocks stay hot?" Jake asked. "The big ones stay warm enough to help for 6 to 8 hours, Lisa replied. "I wrap them in cloth from my spare clothes and put them in my sleeping bag. It is like having a personal heater all night." Jake shared what he had learned about air circulation and heat retention. Together they worked on improving both of their systems. Jake showed Lisa how to create better airflow to make her fires burn more efficiently. Lisa showed Jake how to heat rocks using his metal heat collectors during sunny periods. While they worked, they heard the sound of another transport ship landing nearby. But this time it was not taking away failed candidates. A Vorthek probe ship had landed and one of the crystal beings floated out to observe them. The Vorthek examined the camps of the surviving candidates. It spent a long time looking at the failed aliens who were barely alive in the snow. Then it floated over to examine Jake's cave system and Lisa's fire pit setup. Jake continued working while the alien observer watched. He was installing the curved metal piece as a roof extension for his cave. This would give him more indoor space and better protection from wind. The Vorthek floated closer and its blue glow got brighter as it studied his work. "Human Jake Martinez," the Vorthek said in its voice that came from everywhere. "Explain your construction methods." Jake looked up from his work. This was the first time one of the test proctors had spoken directly to a candidate. "I am building a better shelter," he said simply. "The basic supplies were not enough to survive 7 days, so I am improving them." "Your species lacks natural cold adaptation," the Vorthek observed. "How do you survive while others with superior physical traits fail?" Jake thought about how to answer. He did not want to sound arrogant, but he also wanted to be honest. "We adapt our environment instead of just enduring it. When we have a problem, we find ways to solve it." The Vorthek floated silently for a long moment. Then it moved to examine Lisa's fire pit system. "Human Lisa Park, your fuel sources are limited, yet you maintain consistent heat output. Explain." "This," Lisa stopped tending her fire and looked up at the floating crystal being. "I am not just burning fuel for heat. I'm storing that heat in rocks so I can use it later. 1 hour of burning gives me 8 hours of warmth. This requires planning and delayed gratification," the Vorthek said. "Most species use their resources immediately when stressed." Jake and Lisa exchanged glances. It seemed like the alien proctor was learning something from watching them. Maybe the test was not just about eliminating weak candidates. Maybe it was also about understanding what made different species successful. The Vorthek floated away without saying anything else, but Jake noticed it did not examine any of the other camps. It went straight back to its ship and took off. This made Jake think that the crystal beings were paying special attention to the humans. As the third day turned to evening, Jake could see that the situation was getting desperate for the remaining aliens. Only about 15 candidates were still active, and most of those were barely functioning. The sounds of distress were constant now, and Jake could see several more candidates lying motionless in the snow. Jake settled into his expanded cave for the third night. His improvements were working better than he had hoped. The curved metal roof was reflecting his body. Heat back down, and the multiple chambers were creating a circulation system that kept fresh air moving without losing too much heat. He used one of Lisa's heated rocks as a foot warmer and found it made a huge difference in his comfort level. His sleeping bag was staying dry and warm. His water was not freezing. His food was at a reasonable temperature instead of frozen solid. Outside, the wind was howling louder than ever, but Jake felt confident and comfortable. He was not just surviving anymore, he was thriving. His shelter was better tonight than it had been yesterday, and tomorrow he would make it even better. Jake thought about the Vorthak's questions and observations. The crystal beings had designed this test thinking that natural physical adaptations were the most important factor for survival. They had not expected intelligence and creativity to be more powerful than thick fur or natural antifreeze. The sounds outside were getting quieter as more candidates gave up or stopped moving. Tomorrow there would probably be even fewer survivors. But Jake was sure he would be one of them. He was proving that humans belonged in the Galactic Survival Academy, even if they did not look like the strongest species. The fourth morning was eerily quiet. Jake emerged from his cave to find that most of the desperate sounds from other camps had stopped during the night. He counted the active camps and found only 8 candidates still moving around. The transport ships had been busy taking away the failures. Jake walked around the test area to see who had survived. Besides himself and Lisa, he found 2 other humans still active. Ben Cooper was a young man who had built a windbreak shelter using metal sheets and was surviving by staying in his sleeping bag most of the time. Amy Stone was a woman who had found a natural depression in the rocks and improved it with salvaged materials. The alien survivors were in terrible shape. One Sekthari was still alive but could barely lift its head. It was only breathing because Lisa had shared one of her heated rocks with it during the night. 2 creatures from a species Jake did not recognize were huddled together in what looked like the last stages of hypothermia. One insectoid being was still moving, but its chittering had become very weak. Jake realized that the 4 humans were not just surviving better than the aliens. They were the only candidates who were actually improving their situations instead of just slowly dying. This was a pattern the Vorthak proctors had probably never seen before. Jake spent the morning working on his most ambitious project yet. He was building what could only be called an Arctic research station using nothing but salvaged materials and basic tools. He had expanded his cave system into multiple connected chambers with specific purposes. The entrance chamber was a cold trap that kept the worst air outside. The main workshop area had enough space for him to stand up and work on projects. The sleeping chamber was positioned to capture and hold the most heat. He had even created a crude kitchen area where he could prepare food and melt ice for water. The most impressive part was his heating system. Jake had built a thermal mass heater using metal pipes, rocks, and careful engineering. Cold air would enter through one pipe, get heated by passing over his metal heat collectors and heated rocks, then enter his living space as warm air. The warm air would circulate through his chambers before exiting through another pipe. This created a continuous flow of heated air using very little fuel. Lisa came by to see his progress and was amazed at what he had built. "This looks like something from an Arctic research base," she said as she examined his heating system. "How did you figure out the air circulation?" "I worked at research stations in Alaska," Jake explained. "The principles are the same even if the materials are different. The key is moving air without losing heat and storing thermal energy for when you need it." Jake showed Lisa his latest innovation. He had created a water collection system that melted ice and snow using waste heat from his thermal system. This gave him an unlimited supply of drinking water without using any of his emergency fuel. He had also figured out how to dry his clothes and gear using the warm air circulation. "We need to help Ben and Amy upgrade their shelters," Lisa said. "If they can improve their setups, we might have all 4 humans complete the test." Jake agreed, and they spent the afternoon helping the other 2 humans. Ben's windbreak was effective, but he needed better insulation and heat retention. They showed him how to create a thermal mass system using heated rocks. Amy's rock depression was well protected. But she needed better air circulation to prevent carbon dioxide buildup. Working together, the four humans created a small community of survival experts. Each person had found different solutions to the same problems, and by sharing knowledge, they all improved their chances. Jake noticed that none of the alien candidates were doing this kind of cooperation and knowledge sharing. As the fourth evening approached, Jake saw 3 more Vorthak probe ships land near the test area. This was unusual because normally only one ship came to collect failed candidates. Instead of collecting anyone, the crystal beings floated around examining the camps of the surviving candidates. 1. Vorthak spent a long time studying Jake's thermal heating system. It examined the airflow pipes and the heat collection arrays. It even used some kind of scanning device to measure temperatures inside his shelter chambers. Another Vorthak was studying Lisa's advanced rock heating techniques. Human Jake Martinez. The first Vorthak said, "Your shelter design exceeds the expected parameters for this test. Explain how you achieved thermal efficiency with limited resources." Jake was working on installing a new air intake system when the alien addressed him. "I use the same engineering principles they teach at Arctic research stations. Moving air is easier to heat than still air. Stored heat lasts longer than immediate heat. Insulation works better when you eliminate air gaps. These concepts are not taught to most galactic species," the Vorthak observed. "How does your species acquire this knowledge?" "We live on a planet with many different climates," Jake explained. "Humans have learned to survive in hot deserts, frozen mountains, tropical forests, and ocean environments. We share that knowledge and build on it." The Vorthak floated silently for a moment. "Most species adapt physically to their home environment, then struggle when placed in different conditions. Your species appears to adapt mentally to any environment." Jake had never thought about it that way, but the alien was right. Humans did not evolve thick fur for cold or special organs for heat. Instead, they evolved big brains that could figure out solutions to environmental problems. This made them more flexible than species with specialized physical adaptations. The Vorthak moved to examine the cooperation between the 4 human candidates. It watched as Lisa shared her fire-making techniques with Ben and Amy. It observed Jake helping Amy improve her air circulation system. It seemed very interested in how the humans were working together instead of competing. "Human cooperation patterns differ from other species," the Vorthak noted. "Most candidates focus on individual survival. Your group shares resources and knowledge." "Explain this behavior," Lisa answered this time. "We are stronger together than apart. If one person figures out a better way to do something, we all benefit from learning it. Competition makes sense when resources are limited, but knowledge can be shared without losing anything." The Vorthak spent the rest of the evening observing and taking measurements. Jake got the feeling that the test had become something different from what the crystal beings had originally planned. They were not just testing survival anymore. They were studying human problem-solving methods and social cooperation. As night fell, Jake settled into his improved shelter feeling more confident than ever. His thermal heating system was working perfectly and his living space was actually comfortable instead of just survivable. Outside, the temperature was dropping to the lowest levels yet, but inside his chambers it felt like a warm room. Jake thought about what the Vorthak had observed about human cooperation and adaptation. Maybe this test was showing the crystal beings that there were different kinds of strength. Physical adaptations were one kind, but mental adaptations might be more powerful in the long run. The sounds outside were almost completely quiet now. Most of the alien candidates were gone and the few survivors were too weak to make much noise. But the 4 humans were not just surviving. They were proving that intelligence and cooperation could overcome any environmental challenge. Tomorrow would be the 5th day, and Jake was ready for whatever came next. His shelter was better than many buildings he had seen on civilized worlds. His heating system was more efficient than some modern equipment. He had turned a survival test into an engineering demonstration. The 5th morning brought a sight that Jake had not expected. Instead of transport ships coming to collect failed candidates, a large Vorthak command vessel landed near the test area. Multiple crystal beings floated out along with recording devices and measurement equipment. It looked more like a research expedition than a survival test. Jake stepped out of his shelter complex and was surprised to find that the weather felt almost warm compared to the previous days. His body had adapted to the extreme cold, and his engineering improvements had been so successful that minus 60 degrees no longer seemed impossible to survive. He walked around to check on the other survivors and found a scene that would have been unbelievable a few days ago. All 4 humans were not just alive, but actively improving their living conditions. Ben had upgraded his windbreak into a proper insulated shelter. Amy had expanded her rock depression into a multi-room cave system. Lisa had built what looked like a small Arctic research camp with multiple fire pits and heated work areas. The alien survivors were a different story. Only the Sekthari that Lisa had been helping was still alive, and it was completely dependent on human assistance for survival. The other alien candidates had either been evacuated or had died during the night. Jake realized that the humans were now the only active test participants. The Vorthek command team began conducting detailed examinations of each human shelter. They used scanning devices to measure temperatures, airflow rates, structural integrity, and thermal efficiency. They recorded everything with floating camera devices that moved around like curious insects. Jake was working on his latest project when the lead Vorthek approached him. This crystal being was larger than the others, and its blue glow was brighter and more complex. When it spoke, its voice carried more authority than the test proctors. "Human Jake Martinez," the command Vorthek said. "I am Primary Observer Zekthal of the Galactic Assessment Council. Your performance in this test has exceeded all projected parameters. We require detailed explanation of your methods." Jake looked up from his work. He was installing a crude but functional ventilation fan made from salvaged metal pieces. The fan would improve air circulation in his shelter while using minimal energy. "I am just applying basic engineering principles to solve environmental problems," he said. "Basic for your species, perhaps," Zekthal replied. "In 400 years of conducting this test, no candidate has improved their survival conditions to this degree. Most species focus on enduring until rescue. You have created a permanent settlement." Jake had not thought about it that way, but the alien was right. His shelter complex was no longer a temporary survival setup. It was a functional living space that could support a person indefinitely in this harsh environment. He had essentially built a small Arctic research station using only basic tools and salvaged materials. Zekthal called the other humans over for a group discussion. Lisa, Ben, and Amy gathered around while Morthok observers floated nearby with recording devices. Jake could see that this conversation was being documented as something important. The Galactic Survival Academy has used this test to identify species with superior survival traits, Zekthal explained. "We measure physical adaptation, natural resistance to environmental stress, and individual endurance under extreme conditions. Your species performs poorly on all these metrics, yet you have achieved the highest success rate in test history." Spoke up. "Maybe you are measuring the wrong things. Physical adaptations only work in specific environments. Intelligence and creativity work everywhere." "Explain this concept," Zekthal requested. Ben answered this time. "A species with thick fur is only adapted to cold environments. A species with heat resistance is only adapted to hot environments. But a species that can build tools and solve problems can adapt to any environment." Jake added his thoughts. "We do not try to endure bad conditions. We try to change the conditions to make them better. That is what intelligence is for." The Vorthek observers were silent for a long moment. Jake could see their blue glows pulsing in what might have been communication or deep thought. Finally, Zekthal spoke again. "This perspective requires complete revision of our assessment methods," the primary observer admitted. "We have been selecting for specialized adaptation when we should have been selecting for general adaptability." Lisa asked the question that Jake was thinking. "What happens now? Do we pass the test, or do you need to evaluate us differently?" Zechthel's glow brightened. You have not merely passed the test. You have demonstrated that our test design was fundamentally flawed. The Galactic Assessment Council will need to study your methods and redesign our selection criteria. Over the next 2 days, the Vorthik research team documented everything the humans had built. They measured thermal efficiency, structural engineering, resource utilization, and innovation metrics. They recorded detailed explanations of human problem-solving methods and cooperative strategies. Jake found himself being interviewed about his background and training. The crystal beings were fascinated to learn that human survival knowledge came from thousands of years of living in different environments all over their planet. They were amazed that humans shared this knowledge freely instead of keeping it secret within specialized groups. On the 7th and final day of the test, Zechthel made an announcement that surprised everyone. The 4 human candidates have not only completed the survival test, but have demonstrated capabilities that exceed our instructor qualifications. The Galactic Survival Academy offers you positions as senior faculty members rather than students. Jake looked at his shelter complex one last time before leaving. What had started as a desperate survival situation had become an engineering showcase. His thermal heating system was still running efficiently. His air circulation was maintaining perfect temperature control. His water collection system was producing more clean water than he could use. The Sekthari that Lisa had saved was loaded onto a medical transport for treatment. It would survive because a human had shared knowledge and resources instead of competing for limited supplies. This act of cooperation had been as impressive to the Vorthik as any engineering achievement. As their transport ship lifted off from the frozen surface, Jake could see his shelter complex from above. It looked like a small research station that could house multiple people comfortably. In 7 days, using only basic tools, he had built something that many species could not create with advanced technology. Zechthel approached the humans during the flight back to the Academy. Your species will revolutionize survival training throughout the galaxy. We have spent centuries trying to find the strongest species when we should have been looking for the smartest species. Jake smiled as he looked out at the stars. We do not just survive environments. We adapt them to suit our needs. That is what makes us human. The Vorthak's blue glow pulsed in what Jake was learning to recognize as approval. Indeed, and that is what makes your species invaluable to the galactic community. You do not simply endure challenges, you solve them. Jake realized that this test had been about more than survival. It had been about proving that intelligence and cooperation were more powerful than any physical adaptation. The humans had not just passed the test. They had changed how the entire galaxy thought about survival and strength. The frozen hell of Kepler 442c was behind them now, but Jake knew that the real adventure was just beginning. The galaxy was full of challenges and environments that would test human ingenuity in new ways. But he was confident that whatever came next, humans would find a way to not just survive, but thrive.